Welcome everybody to this week's seminar. My name is Untitled Chapter. I'll be moderating today's session, which is quite special. It's a book launch by Veronica. The title of the book is Bantu Authorities, Apartheid Systems of Race and Ethnicity. This is how we're going to do it. I'm going to give Veronica about 15 to 20 minutes to say something about the book. And then I'm going to give two respondents, which is Ellen and Norman, about 5 minutes each. Please go ahead, Veronica.
Yes, good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are, good evening. Thank you very much, Tokilo, for the introduction, and Jogu for putting the webinar together, and also for a shout out to Antoinette for all the help there. Also, many thanks to the esteemed Africana scholars, Aaron MacKinnon and Norman Etherington, for participating in the book launch of Bantu Authorities, Apartheid System of Race and Ethnicity, which is the result of 20 years of independent study on South Africa since 1990. While as a struggling single mother, I waited for my children to graduate from high school before entering a doctoral program for African history. And in 2008, Stefan Mischer at the UC Santa Barbara kindly took me under his wing. As a Fulbright Hays Fellow, my home state families lived in the former reserves of Reserve 9 and 10 in Mtunzini district in KwaZulu-Natal, which is south of Richards Bay. And I saw firsthand what it was like to live without running water and without electricity. And the legacy of apartheid lives in today's impoverished reserves, as we know. And my quest to understand the building blocks of rural apartheid led me to the system of Bantu Authorities and Ivan Evans' book, Bureaucracy and Race, which is right here. Which I read several times along with all the other literature, but the pages started falling out, so I had to start gluing them back in. I was extremely honored and unfortunate that Ivan took time from his busy schedule as provost at UC San Diego to encourage my work. Now, BA implementation was implemented. BA implemented rural apartheid as indirect rule through chiefs overseen by the Department of Bantu Administration and Development. BA, the book, is a holistic study with the analysis on the system of Bantu Authorities. And it took place because I was in Mtunzini district, where I lived for extended periods from 2009 to 2014. My doctoral research was funded by 2 Fulbright Hays, a Bourne Applause, and several other fellowships, and is informed by over 60 interviews and archival research on 3 continents. So slide 1, if we could put that up, shows the chieftaincies or the Ubukosi in Mtunzini district. I don't know if we can get that map up of Mtunzini district, the chieftaincies with slide number 1. But when we do, what it is, it shows the 6 Ubukosis, and I'm going to start from the bottom, which is Reserve 7A, which was the Dun Reserve, which was a colored reserve and misnomer. It should never been called a native reserve. And then Reserve number 8, which was the Mabini under the Mataba chieftaincy. And then in Reserve 9 was the, at the base was the and Zuza and one of the Zulu clans, and then Mzimela, and then above him Mkonazi, and then reserve number 10, which is to the right or out to the eastern side on the Indian Ocean, was at the base the Mkonazi, other half of the Mkonazi, because it was split by white farms and gum trees, and then at the top of that is the Dube ward, which is just right below Richards Bay. Now, BA, to maintain a cheap labor force, given the unsustainable construction of the reserves, the state set out to control Black mobility and political activism through extended pass laws and by retribalization that tied all Africans, whether urban, rural, detribalized, Christianized, or educated, to the reserves. I don't know if we can get to the slide with the Ubukosi, with the chieftaincies, the map of Mtunzini. Okay, well, maybe we will later. Okay, and slide 2.
Are you not seeing the slides?
No, I'm not. Are you seeing them, Aaron?
No, we're not seeing the proper slides, at least the one that Veronica sent to us.
Oh, good. Okay,
Yeah,
this is fine. Good, great, great. Maybe we can go back to, and if you can do from beginning of slideshow, then we'll see the entire, and then to the second slide, then we'll see the entire screen full of.
Okay. Are you seeing the first slide now?
Yes, I sure am. I sure am, with all the notes on the left-hand side. So if you can just go from the beginning, then that'll become a whole page that'll fill up the whole screen. And if we can go to slide 2, and if you can go up to where it says slideshow, Aaron, if you go to slideshow and you go to, this will begin the slideshow, then it will show the whole thing on one screen. Okay, I don't know, maybe yours is different. Great, thank you, thank you. And so as we said, Mabini, and right over here is 7A, which is the Duna Reserve. And then this is 9, which is Nzuza, Zulu, and the Mela, and Mkonazi portion, the other portion of 10, Mkonazi over here, and Dube. Okay, next slide, please, thank you. And this here shows is my representation of a system of Bantu authorities. And in general, overall, this is we see tribal authority, regional authority, territorial authority. And in Mtunzini, the tribal authority was the Ngambini, Dube, Mkonas, and Mzimela, and Zulu tribal authorities. And these were all under the umbrella of the Mele Swizwe, which is the nation's regional authority, which meetings were held in Mtunzini village at the magistrate. And then KwaZulu Territorial Authority, which became with self-government, KwaZulu Legislative Assembly. Okay, separate development, the euphemism for apartheid, declared that all groups had a right to develop along their own lines with required consolidation of areas along racial and ethnic lines. Hence, BA legitimized the removal of surplus people from the urban areas to the appropriate tribal authority in their homeland, which simultaneously served the needs of white capital for reproduction of a cheap back labor force. Now, the tribal authorities, or TAs, the base of the BA structure, functioned as a network for locating sources of migrant labor linked to rural labor bureaus, which serviced white-owned perimeter industries and the white farms. The term BA, or Bantu Authorities, is referenced in literature on the apartheid era, but rarely examined in depth, except for in Evans' book on Native administration. BA is an understudy area only tangentially examined by scholars alongside the Bantustans and the labor bureaus, arguably so as not to give credence to the system of apartheid. British indirect rule, honed by Lugard and by Theophilus Shepstone to co-opt chieftaincy under the umbrella of colonial magistrates, congealed into the BA system in the Bantu Authorities Act 1951, outlined in the 1948 by the department's chief ethnologist, Nicholas von Warmero. The system of BA provided the mechanisms for a commuter labor force from the Bantustans. So Kiba Lekwate correctly argues that the von Warmelo's outline of the BA system was appropriated by Verwoerd, Dr. Verwoerd, to provide justification for apartheid social engineering of Africans. The mechanisms used by BA began in the 1850s and is well outlined by Dr. Norman Etherington in his work on colonial mapping of chieftaincies. And I found indispensable to my study Aaron MacKinnon's work, particularly his work on the Zulu Land Delimitation Commission and the betterment schemes in the 1930s, betterment often conflated with BA. I am honored to have these scholars here to debate the merits of this book. Next slide, please. Thank you. BA was one of the 6 unjust laws which the ANC and the INC, Indian National Congress, protested against in the 1952-1953 Defiance Campaign. Before 1953, men carried a service contract, but the 1952 abolition of passes established a reference book designed to channel cheap labor to the mines, farms, and industries. But the pass was compulsory for all Africans over the age of 16, and it contains sections A through E. Next slide, please, Aaron, thank you. And you can see A, B, C, D, E sections. And D, Bantu Authorities tax. This is where it was stamped when the Africans paid the tax to their chiefs, who were authorized by the BAA to levy taxes and to punish those who refused to pay. And this is Matsi, to a friend of mine I met in Johannesburg, her father's passbook. And as Evans argues correctly, BA was, quote, was more suggestive than deep. It opened up, it was like a placeholder. The purpose of BA, I argue, was to secure a flow of cheap Black labor to ensure white capital profits. Steeped in ethnos theory, BA built structures based on culture and ethnicity, and with the promotion of Bantu Self-Government Act in 1959, the BA apparatus expanded and further exploited Black labor. And because the department wanted to dump the burden of self-development on the impoverished homelands through increased taxation of Africans. And it aimed to ease the Saunter South African Native Trust budget for other projects. The 1959 Act abolished African representation in Parliament, and with self-government, South African citizenship was traded for Bantustan citizenship in one of the 10 Bantustan. The 1960s was a decade of independence on the continent, and South Africa struggled to replace African nationalism with African ethnicity as a response to African liberation. In the thrust to consolidate the homeland, BA legitimized the removal, as we said, of surplus people. Slide number 5 is the actors. I want to talk a bit about the actors of the Bantu Authorities system. So if we can go to the next slide, which shows a meeting, a conference in 1962 of the Bantu Affairs Commissioner in Pietermaritzburg. And 2 of the people I interviewed are in here. And thank you, a shout out to PJ Warner for sending this wonderful picture so we get an idea. So these were the people in charge, the Bantu Affairs Commissioner. And then slide 6, please, thank you. We see one of the Nkosi in Mtunzini receiving his certificate and being installed by the Chief Bantu Affairs Commissioner, Von Ruyen. So you see, this is a makeshift structure with gum tree pole that was done in the outside. And when I interviewed Nkosi Zulu, who's the only chief that is still living today, he showed me where this all occurred, which is quite unbelievable. And he was just thrilled to remember this day. It was a big day for him. While a few chiefs bought into the system, most resisted and delayed acceptance of BA, which that means agreeing to establish a tribal authority for the clan. And this forced the department to manufacture consent or compliance without consent from clans through threats, bribes, exiles, and few cases murder. In KwaZulu, with a deep history of white rule under Chaptona, especially in Mtunzini district, where the white chief John Dunn, which according to Eminent Samela, he was never a chief. John Dunn, you cannot have a white chief of the Zulu nation. Dunn ruled until 1895. I argue that covert resistance was the standard in KwaZulu, a position that was largely set by Mangosuthu Buthelezi, which was the wait and see approach, which delayed acceptance, much to the frustration of the department, which sought to move to the independent phase for the other 9 homelands after the Transkei accepted BA in 1959. Finally, to facilitate the implementation of the resisted BA system, the Bantu Laws Amendment Act in 1964 deleted a clause from the BAA that required the Governor General to obtain consent from communities or clans when designating a chief for their tribal authority. And the deletion of this clause allowed the department to rewrite the BA script, wherein it was the state that did the accepting and not the African. So things took off from there. The next slide is the department headquarters, from where it's in Pretoria. If we go back just one slide, the head office of the department, Bantu Administration Development in Pretoria, through which all decisions filtered down to the regional office and from there to the district, which in Mtunzini was the site of the showdown between Nkosi Lindelele Mzimela and Bantu Affairs Commissioner at that time, which ended with Nkosi Mzimela's jailing that blew up an eruption in Parliament, and the vet had to answer for that. The book claims, the central claim of this study is that the system of BA provided the infrastructure for rural apartheid and arguably for urban apartheid upon the issuing of reference books, and required the listings of homeland on your reference book. So I have argued that the state's response to its rural dilemma of how much to fund the reserve was to develop Bantustan governments instead of Bantustan infrastructures, which consequently required the need for force to contain Black resistance as poverty grew in the reserves, as we can see today in this legacy. The second claim for this book is the system of BA prolonged apartheid by providing the legitimizing infrastructure for rural and arguably urban apartheid. This claim has 3 parts. First, in providing the infrastructure for rural apartheid, the BA system distorted 2 traditions. I mean, we all know that the Ubakosi, the tradition, chieftaincy, had already been distorted by the British long ago, but it was distorted even further through wealth accumulation. and the idea of reciprocity became between the chief and subject was basically cut, causing one Nkosi and Zuza to apply for a gun permit because his people were so up in arms about Bantu Authorities. He wanted to protect himself. And the other tradition was a commissioner tradition of the Brownlee, where the commissioner was a guardian for the African. Second, the BA system assisted the department in collecting data for the reference book and contribute to the centralization of the department, which in 1909, when all the four provinces congealed into, the 1910 unification of South Africa, they wanted centralization of all the different native administration under this one umbrella. And this took for Verwoerd to actually the centralization to occur. So I'm stating that the BA system assisted the department in collecting data for the reference book, which contributed to the centralization of the department, because unless you know where people are residing, you can't function. Third, the BA served to protect a white capitalist profit more than racial purity, the latter which was recognized by the Tomlinson report as unattainable. The central state would have likely been forced much earlier than the 1980s to turn to pure brute force, which ultimately was the death knell for apartheid, along with economic sanctions and others. Costumed in culture and ethnicity and crowned with African, quote, independence, the study argues BA provided state legitimacy through pseudo-independence for African oppression, and therefore extended the lifespan of apartheid. The book is divided into 4 parts. Part 1 explores the department's push to gain acceptance of BA. Part 2 covers the consolidation of the reserves in response to interim chief Mjabu Sene Dube's defense of compliance without consent. How could we resist? He speaks about the inevitability of apartheid. Part 3 examines the devolution of power from the Department of the Homelands and Prince Buthelezzi's role in devolution. Part 4 covers the transition to democracy and considers the system of BA prolonged apartheid and protected white capitalist profits despite the Natal massacres. Finally, the conclusion asks how the rule dilemma faced by prior minority rule regimes parallels with the current majority rule government. And the epilogue focuses on the Convention for Democratic South Africa, CODESA, and examines the outcome of negotiations and the legacy of BA structures in today's rural areas with the passing of the 2003 Traditional Governance Framework Act and its 2019 amendment. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Veronica, for sharing your book with us. At this point, I'm going to give Aran about 5 minutes to respond. And after that, I'm going to ask Norman to jump right in so that we open up for discussions and questions. And colleagues can also use the chat facility to pose the questions, and I'm happy to read some of them.
Great, thank you so much. And thanks, Veronica, for your work in this field. It's delightful to be along for the ride here. Just by way of background, some people may know a little of the work that I did, and Veronica mentioned it, sort of dug deep into the archives in the region of Zululand all the way back last century. And my heart still lives in the dunes of Mtunzini and that region, despite having ended up out here in the US. So interestingly enough, I first came across Veronica's work in the southeast of the US at a graduate studies conference way back, as I say, last century. And it was delightful to come across a graduate student at that point who had undertaken what I thought was a very important piece in this arc of the story about the unique nature of South African apartheid politics in its formative period, as well as this critical sort of approach that takes us into a micro study. I applaud Veronica's tireless efforts. I mean, when I read the book, looked at the manuscript, wrote a little bit about it, I was very taken by the depth of her interest in getting to know the people in their context. And you can really get a sense of the relationship between politics, culture, and identity in her study of this region. So that was, I think, really awakening, and I think an important contribution, as well as this temporal piece that she's introduced here. I will say, you know, I spent a great deal of time, perhaps more than I should have, digging deep into the story of the 1902 Joint Imperial Colonial Lands Delimitation Commission, and it was a fascinating study. It was very detailed in its analysis, notwithstanding the politics. The commissioners spent a great deal of time on the ground, measuring out things piece by piece, but they also, too, spent a lot of time chronicling and developing their understanding of the relationship between chieftaincy and space and land, and how they were going to then codify that in this bastardized approach to the opening of the region to white capitalist interests. And not to sing out for my work in particular, but I think it was actually Norman, as a sort of segue to his discussion. I remember vividly a conference paper, I believe it was at an ASA conference some years ago, maybe Chicago. Perhaps Norman will remember better than I, but in which he posited an argument about looking at the map of South Africa and considering the relationship of people to the lands they ended up with. And it was an interesting argument. I think at the time we didn't really fully grasp the import of it. Maybe you can unpack it further for us, Norman, at this stage, but it was a really compelling argument about the fact that Africans were able to retain access to some critical areas of resource-rich lands. And of course, when you look at the sort of, as I say, bastardized mosaic of Zululand and the way in which the reserves were reconfigured, I think going back to that map, going back to that 1902 delimitation, as Veronica has, is an important starting point for understanding what were the potential outcomes for things like Bantu Authorities, and especially the things that came out of the failure to reinvest as they had sought to do, you know, during various points in which the idea of propping up Bantu Authorities was mooted at various points in time. I will just sort of in closing to sort of point out that I think that this story that Veronica is telling is an important one, primarily for those two reasons. One, that we do have an intimate sense of the personal understanding of chiefs in the context of the politics of the day, and that deep dive into it. And two, it is a critical temporal piece that takes us from the early machinations of the Shepstonian system. Norman, I know, will speak more to that important part, I think, but all the way through the work of people like Nick Cope, Ivan Evans, Paul LaHouse did masterful work on our understanding of rural identities in that context. So a big shout out to his seminal work. And I think we're following on with that, this important piece of understanding at the local level, how people understood their relationship, not just to the politics of Bantu Authorities, but what it meant for the spaces they were able to inhabit. So that's my kickoff. I will pass it on to Norman and say thank you again for an opportunity to join in.
All right, thank you. Please go ahead, Norman. Is Norman still with us?
Tukelo, yeah, he seems to have dropped out. Maybe he'll come back in a minute.
Okay, all right. Maybe we give him a couple of minutes to see if he can come back. But I think we can let the discussion continue. I saw one question by Ali. So Ali says, Veronica, that you use the word detribalized. Do you at any stage of your book problematize the label? And is there a view, there is a view that I share that in isiZulu language, there is no equivalent to the word for the formation tribe.
Okay, so are you saying, I mean, I know we're not using quote tribe anymore, we put it in scare quotes, and I try to use the word clan. Is this what we're addressing? Am I understanding the question correctly?
Yeah, so he says you use the word detribalized.
Oh, detribalized, yeah, that's what they sought to do, is detribalize retribalize is what BA sought to do, is retribalize everybody, because before then, before apartheid came in, actually there was still talk of assimilation, which would require detribalization. So being as apartheid wanted everything to be under the department, all Africans to be controlled by the department through their chiefs, it required retribalization, and there was a great deal of promotion put into that in order to have that control, to be able to get that data that this clan is here, there's so many people here, this data, this clan's here. But if people were not agreeing to that and they all fled to the city, then it became very, very difficult. This is where they then needed to get what was called a representative. The department actually paid for a representative, African representative for different regions, different districts. And Tanzania had its own representative, which was housed and had an office and a secretary, you know, in Peter Marsburg. So it was supposed to be coming together of the people who were in the urban, the Zulu urban, who were from KwaZulu-Natal or KwaZulu, but it never really worked because there was no trust. And Professor Lakwate was the one who put me onto that, because, you know, they actually were pretty much informants, because they were paid, the African representatives were paid, and so they would put all the information back into the department.
Right. I think that Norman is back. Please indicate if you're able to speak now, Norman.
I'll just unmute myself. You hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yes, for reasons unknown, I lost my connection. I just want to start by, I was so interested that in Veronica's slide of the book recording the payment of the tax, and it made me just go up to my bookshelf and get this little thing that I show you here, which is a hut tax receipt from 1869, received from Chief Blank of the tribe of, the sum of so many being the payment of the hut tax for the year 1869. Now, my contribution is pretty limited, because I know a lot more about the beginnings of these authorities to regulate chieftainship and the governance of Africans in the colonial era than I know about the subsequent era. So my interest in Veronica's book is that it filled in some blanks. So we had the works several of us contributed to in the 19th century, especially in KwaZulu-Natal. We had Aran's work. Then at the other end, presently, we've got a lot of work being done on traditional authorities and how they work. I think particularly of John Komaroff's edited collection from 2018, which is really interesting on the subject of the current powers of chieftainship. When I read those sorts of books, I am really struck by how much the system for classifying people into tribes and under chiefs and in a hierarchy changed over time. It just changed out of all recognition. I noticed a lively stream going of chats in the side panel while the others were speaking, which was saying, how did this word tribe get in here? And it's a subject I used to debate with Jeff Guy, who wanted to hang on to the word because once it was invented, it lived a life of its own. And my insistence that there was only ever chieftainship, and people defined themselves before the colonial era, in the eras that I know about, by who was the chief. Who did you belong to as a chief? And the term tribe comes from outside, and it comes from the colonial authorities. That much is clear. I just was fascinated by the amount of primary source material that Veronica was able to put between the pages of her book. So when people have migrated to other ways of looking at things and different ways of theorizing, they'll still be going back to her book to see what real people said at the time about how the system they were charged with administering actually worked. So that's the tribute I want to pay to Veronica. I do want to say that there's lots more of story to be filled in. And that is what's going on with the chiefs over time. They are subjected to a form of government in which they play an important part. The part that they play is largely, but not entirely, dictated to them. They cease to be traditional, but they retained authority. And lots of the authority they retained was of no interest to colonial administrators, and so lay undisturbed until the anthropologists got onto it. I'm thinking about the ritual functions of chieftainship, the part they played in protecting people against witchcraft, in making rain, in carrying charms against poisons. I would be really interested in some studies which could get us down to seeing what happened amongst the chiefs who survived. Obviously, at first, they didn't know they were tools of a colonial authority. That system evolved. And it's also, I'm very interested in how much the present people who call themselves chiefs and kings owe their positions to the development of the system under colonial rule and under apartheid. Think of things like the late Zulu king's grab for authority across the whole of KwaZulu-Natal. What was that based on? That he should be the supreme chief and the king. Well, he really adopted the Boer theory of 1838, that all the territory that had ever been attacked by Shaka Zulu and his regiments was theirs by right of conquest. So the Zulu king conquered that land. The Boers conquered the Zulu king, therefore they succeeded as owners to all his lands. And now that position, which was the position of the trekkers, both in Natal and in the Transvaal in the old Republic days, is taken up by the king of the Zulus now. So who benefits? That's another question that interests me. Mm-hmm. I'll just say something briefly about Aaron's question about my 2000 and, when was it? I think it was 1998. in Chicago. He's right about Chicago. And the argument that I was making was that we haven't properly recognized the degree to which successful resistance in defensible areas of value to mixed farmers succeeded. I was just rereading David Livingstone's book on his first travels, his famous first book, and he was very strong on the subject of the African resistance. He was an early advocate of armed resistance himself. He believed people should be able to arm themselves in self-defense against the white invaders. And he made the point that trekkers and colonists didn't go where the people had learned to defend themselves. And if you looked at that famous horseshoe map of the Bantu stands and reserves, it corresponds to areas of good rainfall, of good agricultural land, it was defensible land. So the story of chieftainship the traditional, it's a new hierarchy, 3 high of traditional leaders recognized. All of that has happened, but at every point, chiefs and their people who were complicit in this were constantly negotiating, resisting, trying to define their own territories on their own terms. And that, I think, is the other story where we have all sorts of gaps to fill in. I think I went more than 5 minutes.
Yes, you did, but that's totally okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We'll open it up for questions, comments, if anyone. And as I indicated, that you can also use the chat function, and I'm happy to read the question. Maybe it's sort of just to start, and anyone can answer this question between Ellen or Norman, even Veronica. So, I mean, how do you feel the book sort of contributes to literature on rural apartheid? And then for Veronica, your last slide, you spoke about Mangosuthu. So I'm interested in how did Mangosuthu Buthelezi affect the implementation of Bantu authorities? Yeah.
Maybe I'll just jump in very briefly, because I did want to mention a piece that Veronica addresses, which I think is also critical and probably bears re-examination, is the Tomlinson Commission and the Social and Economic Planning Committee's report, late 40s into the 50s, when you're looking at a time in which there's this, I wouldn't say reflection or crisis of conscience, but at least some sober thinking about what extent does apartheid require rural investment in order to shore it up. And of course, this is part of a longer discourse about what the rural reserves meant in the larger system. And I think, Veronica's book does point us in the direction of reassessing that rural-urban relationship of capitalism and the instrumentality of BA to, the outcomes of the capitalist industrial complex. But of course, as we all know, it's much more complicated than that, both in an economic sense and in a political sense. But I think, as Norman was calling for perhaps further examination of the nature of chieftaincy and the long arc of that, I think also the economic dimensions of rural investment. There's not some inconsiderable money flowing into the rural areas as a function of attempts at what the Tomlinson Commission suggested. Of course, it fell far short and was corrupted by all of the other dimensions. But I think that is perhaps an area that is worth mentioning, that the book points us in that direction again.
Thank you.
I'm sure I'd be ready to comment if I could remember what the question was to Kayla.
So I was asking, and I think that Erin partly answered the question. I was asking what sort of contribution does the book make in terms of the existing literature on rural apartheid? And my second question really was how did Mangosuthu Buthelezi actually affect the implementation of BA? Yeah.
Yes, I think there's a lot to be said on that, especially, well, Buthelezi took the system up and ran with it. He especially what he took was the concept that had developed over 150 years, that the subjects of a chief constituted an ethnicity or an ethnic group that was like a nation and therefore deserved to control its own destiny. This was, I think, from a historical point of view, profoundly mistaken, but for Buthelezi, it was profoundly useful. I was just reading the latest issue of the South African Historical Journal with a conversation about those primary so-called Zulu riots of a couple of years ago. It's a good little exchange of opinions, but that was described as mobilized ethnicity. Then people challenge that, but there is no ethnicity for me. There's no ethnicity in what we conventionally call pre-colonial South Africa. It just doesn't exist. It's brought into being by things like the Shepstone system, its reference to tribes, the anthropologizing of colonial authority, a whole lot of other things. One aspect, though, that Aran referred to and talked about Veronica's discussion of the economic impact of the BA system was something that I think remains constant from Theophilus Shepstone in 1850s to right up to 1994, and that is indirect rule, the Shepstone system, Bantu authorities, all these were a way of making Africans pay for their own administration, pay for their own government.
Yeah.
But it wasn't a government that they didn't run, they didn't control, and in which they had no say.
Right. I don't know if you want to add something there, Veronica, but I wanted to read Alan's question. So he says that I'd like to add to Tukwele's questions about what the book adds to the literature on rural apartheid, to ask what does the book add to understanding of what has transpired since 1994 with respect to traditional authorities, and what does history have to say about how we got here? Okay,
yes, that's a very involved question and a very hot topic. So I'm going to try to be very sensitive here. You know, like Norman was saying, his study, when I first read, his work, and he was talking about how the magistrate in, I don't know, some district in the Transkei in the 1850 or something, was saying to the colonial officer, whoever the lieutenant governor was at that time, that I can't take a data. I mean, I can't take census. People migrate. They don't go under a certain chief. They're, you know, even household heads. And so they set about codifying this and saying, these people are here, these people are here. And this is how, you know, Norman follows the mapping of chieftaincy, which was required to implement Bantu authorities 100 years later. But not only that, but also the idea that you have in place in each district, and we're talking about rural apartheid. I'm hoping this answers it. You have in each district of rural Africa a magistrate, and which is under the department. First was Department of Native Affairs, and in 1950 became the Department of 1958 became the Department of Bantu Administration and Development when Verwoerd became minister. And this is the Shepstonian system of indirect rule, but it became codified, intensified, and there was, you know, data that told you where these people were located. All you had to do was go to the commissioner's office, and you can get, you know, a pretty reliable census, which they couldn't get before. And this is what rural apartheid required if we were going to get enough of the usable labor into the mines, into the industrial area, and of course after that commission, that was Herbst's commission, where they really tried to find how to delineate, we'll send labor here to the mines, we'll send labor to the industrial area, we'll send labor to the farms. Farms were complaining because they didn't have any labor. So we had to get these people back to the rural areas so they could serve the white farmers too, so this just continues. And the question, I think, basically, how does this impact today? Well, you know, the majority rural government is trying very hard to deal with what I call a rural dilemma. How do you fund the rural areas which are sprawling? If you've lived there, you say, you know, people may have a cell phone, but they don't have the money to pay for it to be charged. And so it's very difficult situation. So you need somebody that you can call and talk to. And this is what Bantu Authorities achieves today. The system achieves today. It's the same structure as Mangosuthu Buthelezi, who I could go on for about an hour about, you know, was very responsible for, and the Ngonyama Trust, which then funded, you know, this system, and whether or not the rural people who are subjects of their local chief, while also being citizens of South Africa, that's a real dilemma that the government is trying to deal with. That's
Norman, I think you're muted. He always forgets.
Okay. I would add to that one of those great transitions that takes place over time is the relationship of chieftainship and belonging to a people, and the chief is connected to land and land ownership. Yeah. Prior to the advent of surveying and land titles and so forth in South Africa, unlike some other places in West Africa, for instance, and other colonial situations, chieftaincy was not ever defined in terms of land. It wasn't the land you controlled, it's the people who recognized you and brought you your authority. So one thing that has really changed is that you see in relation to present authorities, attempts which happened all the way through over the last nearly 200 years to define tribes and chiefs, using those phrases, in terms of the land that they owned. The other thing that's been happening with traditional authorities, and this comes out very well in one of the articles in the Komarov book collection that I referred to earlier, is the introduction of the notion of orderly succession via primogeniture, i.e., there is a person who's the son of the person, and their son has the right to succeed as the chief. Now, that wasn't the pre-colonial situation, wasn't even the colonial situation. Just consider the Zulus alone. Shaka came to power as the result of deposing someone else. He was deposed by his brothers. Mpanda survived only for his children to wage a civil war in 1856-57 over who should succeed. And this goes on until the conquest of Zululand. And then chieftainship begins to get hardened into a system which decrees so-and-so has the right to be a chief and someone doesn't. Now, I want to suggest provocatively that the succession dispute was not an abnormality which is corrected by the institution of primogeniture, as we see happening with traditional authorities now, but it was the rule. And the succession, the appearance of a new chief was the result of a negotiation, not just a battle between the claimants, but a negotiation between the people who had their own ideas about who should be a chief and the various claimants. And sometimes they fought it out. And this continues in some places. David Maxwell's first book in Zimbabwe gets to its climax over a succession dispute. If you wander into the Natal depot of the, KwaZulu Natal depot of the archives in Pietermaritzburg, into the old Native Affairs Department papers, what takes up the most room are the voluminous papers relating to succession disputes. And they just happen all the time. Now, if we started regarding them as normal, we would perhaps question a lot of what is said today about who's a chief, who's a king, who has the right of succession, a lot of questions.
Let me just jump in on a couple of things quickly there. I think, Norman, a very insightful point, but I think that way lies madness. I think trying to unpack succession disputes. But I would like to return very briefly to the point you made about relationship to the land. I think it may actually have been at the same ASA that we spoke of about, in Chicago, that I once brazenly and foolhardily challenged the late, great Bill Freund on a statement he made about irreducible ethnicity. And I think this was in reference to his recent book at the time on Indians in Durban. And he spoke about certain representations of ethnicity that were, he felt, irreducible. And I said, Bill, how could you possibly say that? This is all constructed. What could you mean? And he made reference to certain things such as cuisine, for example, or dress, for example, that were markers. And of course, I think if you look at The Invention of Tradition, for those who may remember that book, of course, many of those things are quite literally fabricated as well. But the one thing that I wanted to come back to, and it takes me back to that 1902 Delimitation Commission, was one of the things that people really literally dug their heels into the ground about. And I would love to hear from others about their insights on this, but was where their ancestors had been buried. And for them, this seemed to me to be the absolute sine qua non of their relationship of identity to the land. And it sort of along the same lines as digging into the archives in succession disputes, I wonder if anybody knows of any studies looking at burial practice and the idea we speak about the absurdity of trying to move a graveyard and what that means. I must say, ever since I discovered that piece in the contestations over the Delimitation Commission, I just don't know if anyone else has come across that reverence for and association of people, identity, and burial in the context of these conversations about chieftaincy.
Yeah, and
Frozen.
hello.
Yeah, go ahead, Veronica.
Okay, I don't have the screen anymore. Oh, here it's back. Okay, yeah, I wanted to say is the idea of every time a community or a clan was removed by apartheid, they had their ancestors buried on the ground. Now, at the University of Zululand, Zulu, when they had to get this, you know, with the 1959 extension of University Act, they had to get UniZulu open, which was the Zulu tertiary institution that was in reserve number 9 in Konaz reserve. And people got up in arms because, you know, they had their dead family ancestors buried there. And you're gonna put, you know, this university on top of our ancestors. And also in Kosi Mataba was talking about how when there was a hotel in the area that under there was some of his ancestors, and trying to get back these lands, because ancestors are very important to Zulu identity, you know, and chiefs are the entryway into the ancestors. And when I was at Mkonazi, I lived there for a while in that, you know, in that homestead. They have a rendezvous, you know, where they go and they offer incense to their ancestors. And just before, so it's really important not to have to move the ancestors. And that is desecration. And I know Dr. Mbuli, Thelonious Mbuli, who is fortunately no longer here because he would be here talking. When I went to his family's farm in Mpumalanga, they had, his family was buried there. Now, if they're going to be removed, are you going to unearth these, you know? So it's very hard. It breaks that link. And just really, really quickly, I wanted to answer somebody's question in the chat about the other. What's the difference between rural and urban? Rural is basically, we're talking about the former reserves. We're talking about the place where, you know, all the homelands were even they had perimeter around the reserve. They had perimeter industry, but the actual was usually, or they're always from what was put down in the Zululand Land Delimitation Commission. Now, if you're talking about the other areas like the Transkei, the Ciskei, whatever, that all that information is in the National Archives in Pretoria, or in the, you know, whatever is the main capital of that former province now. So I hope that answers that.
Right. Thank you very much, Veronica, for launching your book with us. Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, Norman, for your contributions as well. Perhaps at this point, I should invite you to make your closing remarks, maybe say a little bit how we can get the book. Perhaps there's a student discount to get the book. Yeah, and thanks again.
well, I guess I'll go first, just really briefly. I want to thank everyone, and I want to thank everyone who participated, and I want to thank Wits History Workshop, which I have been watching for the last, ever since it went, online, thanks to COVID. I have learned so much, and got to see people that I had read their work, but I never seen them. So as for the book, it's on the announcement. The link is on the announcement. Unfortunately, trying to get the book out of from the U.S. to South Africa has proved an immense challenge. I don't know what's happening with the postal system in South Africa, but 4 people's books have been delayed somewhere, lost, whatever. So the ebook might be your best option. And thank you so much.
All right, thank you very much for everyone. This brings the end of this book launch. A copy of this webinar will be available on the Wits History Workshop website and our YouTube page. Thank you very much to everyone. Bye-bye.